In 2006, 300 Australian commandos walked into a valley in southern Afghanistan that barely existed on coalition maps. They expected to stay for 9 days. What they found was an enemy willing to fight from behind thick mud walls, hidden rooftops, narrow courtyards, and mountain ridges overlooking every move they made. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition and water ran low. Sleep disappeared. And every doorway could be hiding a fighter waiting to kill them at point-blank range. But the Australians kept moving forward, compound by compound, wall by wall, metre by metre. This wasn't a conventional battle. It was a 9-day fight where the enemy was almost impossible to see, until he was only a few feet away. Stay with us, because what happened inside the Chora Valley would become one of the fiercest battles Australian forces had fought since Vietnam.
A valley in southern Afghanistan, 40 kilometers northeast of a small Australian base at Tarin Kowt. On the coalition maps of 2006, the ground shows up as a blank. No patrols, no presence, no sustained coalition foot on soil. 300 Australians are about to walk into it. They intend to stay 9 days. When it is over, in September of that year, the Herald Sun in Melbourne will describe what happened in the valley as the bloodiest battle Australians have fought since Vietnam. That phrase belongs to the newspaper. It does not belong to the arithmetic. Vietnam cost Australia 521 dead across a decade of war. The Chora Valley cost 1 Australian killed and 13 wounded across 9 days. What the newspaper meant by bloodiest was intensity, days of close fighting, ground taken metre by metre inside walled compounds. A special operations task group standing inside a place that had been off the map, with an enemy that had chosen to stand as well. This is the story of those 9 days, told the way the men who fought it thought about it at the time. Not as a series of attacks, as a shape on a map, a valley being closed. The valley has a name, Chora. It sits inside Uruzgan province, in the rough country north of Kandahar, in the geography that outsiders have historically failed in. A long green ribbon of irrigation ditches and mud brick compounds and grape huts, walled orchards, thick with fruit trees in summer. Water runs down out of the hills through carefully maintained channels that are older than the men who dig them out each year. The compounds are old. Some of them have walls 2 feet thick. The village clusters are pushed up against one another the way houses grow when land is precious and the ground has to work. Around the ribbon, the country rises fast into ridges and dry rocky spurs, and above that, mountain, the high ground, looks down on everything the valley does. From the ridges, on a clear day, a man with binoculars can see men moving in the fields 2 kilometers away and see them well. For most of 2006, the valley belonged to the Taliban, not in the abstract sense that Uruzgan belonged to the Taliban, in the concrete sense. Fighters lived in the compounds. Weapons caches sat under grape hut floors. Money and food and communications ran through the valley. Rest and reset happened there. Commanders held councils in rooms that Australian soldiers would later stand in and photograph. Chora was the store cupboard behind the fight in Uruzgan. If you were sending men and rockets down onto the coalition and the Dutch and the Afghans in the low country, you were sending them out of the ribbon of green. Everybody knew this. Nobody had gone in and stayed. Why nobody had gone in and stayed is the harder question. The answer is partly ground. The answer is partly force. The answer is partly the fact that the summer of 2006 was the summer the Taliban decided to stand and fight in the south of Afghanistan, and there were not enough coalition troops in the whole province to be in more than one place at once. The Dutch were the framework nation for Uruzgan. They were still deploying men and equipment into their new base. The Americans were fighting hard further south. The British were fighting hard further west. The Australians had a small provincial reconstruction task group at Tarin Kowt, and they had the Special Operations Task Group, which was a different animal. The Special Operations Task Group was what the Australians had built to reach into ground the rest of the coalition could not reach. The Australian force at Tarin Kowt was, on paper, the Special Operations Task Group, working under Lieutenant Colonel Mark Smethurst. On the ground, it was two things joined. The Special Air Service Regiment, The SASR, whose squadrons had been rotating through Afghanistan since 2001 and who did most of the deep patrol and reconnaissance work, and the 4th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, the Commando Battalion, 4R Commando, whose men did the direct action, the compound clearing, the close fight. Around 300 Australians in total: snipers, assaulters, reconnaissance patrols, signallers, combat engineers, explosive ordnance disposal, medics, a joint offensive support cell that could talk to any aircraft in coalition airspace, interpreters, a small headquarters element. None of them were conscripts. All of them were volunteers who had passed selection courses that took months and broke most of the men who tried them. They had trained together. They had operated together. Many of them were on their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th rotation through Afghanistan. What that meant, in practical terms, was that the 300 were not a general-purpose infantry force. They were a scalpel. Scalpels do not clear valleys the way axes do. Scalpels do it by cutting exactly where they need to cut, and by not cutting where they do not. They were not going in alone. Chora was part of a broader coalition operation, involving more than 500 troops from 6 nations. The Dutch Korps Commando Troepen, the KCT, the Netherlands Special Forces, worked alongside the Australians. Regular Dutch infantry and armoured elements would take blocking positions on the flanks and on the roads leading into the valley from the Low Country. British, American and Afghan elements played roles in the wider offensive that summer. But inside the ribbon of the Chora Valley itself, at the sharpest point of the operation, the 300 were Australian, with the Dutch commandos working the sectors alongside them. The Dutch, in particular, would matter. The KCT was a small force with a long history. Their operators had been in Afghanistan doing deep reconnaissance and target development for longer than most people realized. Working alongside Australian commandos and SASR patrols, they slotted in cleanly. Languages were a problem for about the first hour, and then were not a problem. Radios were made to talk to one another. Task organization ran across national lines when it needed to. That kind of interoperability is easier to plan than to do. Perth was a case study in doing it. The wider offensive that Perth sat inside was worth understanding for what it said about the coalition effort in the south. More than 500 troops from 6 nations moved in coordinated tasks that summer, with the Chora Valley clearing at the sharp end and blocking positions and shaping operations running out from it. Regular Dutch infantry, working with armoured support, held the roads and the ground beyond the ribbon. Afghan National Army elements attached where they could add value and where their presence with the coalition force could be sustained. American aviation and intelligence support ran overhead. British contribution came through the shared coalition picture. It was not the kind of coordinated offensive that gets its own movie made about it. It was the kind of coordinated offensive that gets shorthanded into a paragraph in a defense annual report. The men who did the work knew what it had taken to make the paragraph. The plan was not one push. The plan was synchronized clearing. That distinction matters. A single push would have concentrated the Australians at one end of the valley and driven them along it, compound by compound, day after day, with the Taliban falling back through prepared positions of their choosing and reinforcing at the far end. A synchronized clearing put separate teams into separate parts of the valley at the same time, with air movement holding the shape together. Compounds cleared, high ground occupied, cordons dropped, reconnaissance out ahead. Every element working to a schedule that the enemy could not read, because it did not have the pattern of a single advancing line. The distances involved were small. The valley was not enormous. The intensity of that kind of operation, though, was enormous. When you split a small force across a valley and clear inside compounds at the same time, every team is closer to the ground than a battalion attack would put them. Every team is inside compound range weapons. Every team is fighting its own fight, and depending on the other teams doing the same. The margin for error at task group level was thin. It was thin because it had to be. There was no other way to get the shape closed in 9 days. The plan did not come from nothing. It came from weeks of reconnaissance that most of the men going into the valley would never hear about in detail. Long-range patrols from the SASR had been putting eyes on the Chora Valley from the surrounding ridges for weeks before Perth began. Small teams, 2 and 3 men, moving at night, lying up in daylight in observation posts, scraped into rock. They had watched who came and who went. They had timed the movement patterns. They had marked the compounds that showed the signs of long occupation. They had identified likely fighting positions, likely command locations, likely caches. Some of that reconnaissance had been done from the air, in coordinated tasking with coalition assets, and much of it had been done on foot, at the price of days of discomfort and thirst and the constant risk of compromise. But by the time the task group headquarters put the synchronized clearing plan together, the map board already carried a picture of the valley that the Taliban did not know existed. The plan was as good as it was because the reconnaissance had been as good as it was. Day 1. Held ground, nothing. Not held ground, the whole valley. The mouth of the Chora Valley opens, where a wadi runs down out of the hills into a wider bowl. On the morning of the first day, Australian patrols moved into the low ground and began the process of shaping the entry. Snipers went to the high spurs. Reconnaissance patrols pushed forward into the first belt of compounds. Coalition air moved over the ridgelines. Blocking positions on the far flanks were set by other elements of the wider offensive. The purpose of Day 1 was not to fight. The purpose of Day 1 was to fix the enemy in place, to let the Taliban see that Australians were in the valley, and to give them something to look at while other elements went in behind. The heat that first day was already the enemy nobody talked about. July in Uruzgan is dry, dusty, 40 degrees and rising. No shade outside the compounds themselves. Body armor and helmet and load-carrying gear on top of a fighting kit. Radio and battery, ammunition, grenades, water. Every man was carrying between 30 and 40 kilograms, depending on what job he had that day. Water rationing began on Day 1 because it had to. Every man was carrying what he was going to drink, and what he was going to drink was going to have to be resupplied by air within the first 24 hours, or the operation would go into a different shape. Contact came in the afternoon. Small arms out of a compound at the mouth of the valley. A short exchange, the kind of engagement that lasted less than a minute, but told everybody watching that the Taliban were in position and that the valley was going to be defended. The fighters withdrew into cover deeper in the ribbon. The Australians moved up onto the position they had just cleared. The first compounds at the mouth of the valley changed hands. Day 1 closed with the mouth of the valley open. Day 2 held ground. The mouth, not held ground, everything above the mouth. Now the shape began to shrink. On the second morning, the Australians moved into the first compound belt. What a compound belt looks like on a map is a cluster of thick-walled squares laid against one another along an irrigation line. What a compound belt looks like on the ground is a warren. Doorways 2 men wide, blind courtyards inside 4-metre walls, roof lines connected so a man can move from one house to the next without ever coming down. Grape huts, low mud buildings with slit ventilation holes, standing separately in the fields. Any of it can hold a shooter. All of it can hide caches. A trained enemy in that terrain can conduct an ambush from a distance of 5 meters and be gone by the time the second team arrives. The clearing worked to a rhythm. A team stacked on a doorway, a grenade in first. Entry. Corners cleared, rooms cleared, roof cleared, compound consolidated. The next compound. Then the next. Sniper teams on the high spurs read the movement in the fields ahead and pass the picture down. Reconnaissance patrols worked the flanks so nothing came in from the sides. Every hour the map board at the task group headquarters shifted. Squares that had been red became blue. Blue squares became strong points. Strong points became the baseline for the next move. The Taliban fought back. In some compounds, they had prepared positions and fought hard from them, standing at the door of a rear room and firing on the entry team, or shooting from a rooftop through irrigation smoke. In other compounds, they had already gone, leaving weapons, hides and food, and papers and the smell of recent occupation. Nobody could tell in advance which compound was which.
In 2006, 300 Australian commandos walked into a valley in southern Afghanistan that barely existed on coalition maps. They expected to stay for 9 days. What they found was an enemy willing to fight from behind thick mud walls, hidden rooftops, narrow courtyards, and mountain ridges overlooking every move they made. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition and water ran low. Sleep disappeared. And every doorway could be hiding a fighter waiting to kill them at point-blank range. But the Australians kept moving forward, compound by compound, wall by wall, metre by metre. This wasn't a conventional battle. It was a 9-day fight where the enemy was almost impossible to see, until he was only a few feet away. Stay with us, because what happened inside the Chora Valley would become one of the fiercest battles Australian forces had fought since Vietnam.
That was the point of doing it the way it was being done. Assume the fight. Never assume the empty room. The one time you assume the empty room is the time it kills you. What compound range fighting means, in the specific language of the men who did it, is fighting inside distances that would fit in a suburban backyard. A Kalashnikov round crossing a courtyard travels the distance in a time that cannot be reacted to. A grenade thrown from a rooftop into a courtyard below arrives faster than the human brain processes seeing it leave the hand. The margins are measured in the training of the men involved, and the drills they have run 100 times, and the way they move through a doorway without thinking about it, because their bodies know. When the men who did the clearing at Chora described the fighting afterward, the word most of them reached for was intimate. They meant it in the specific sense that they had been close enough to see the eyes of the men they were fighting. That kind of closeness is not what most modern battles look like. It is what Chora looked like. It is why the newspaper reaching for the word bloodiest was reaching, in a fumbling way, for something that could describe the character of what had happened, without needing to defend the arithmetic. By the end of the second day, the first compound belt had changed hands. Small arms wounds had come back through the medical chain. Assault teams had rotated. Water and ammunition had been pushed forward. Overhead, an Australian Chinook out of the 5th Aviation Regiment had run a lift into a landing zone that had not existed 24 hours earlier. The valley shape on the map board had shrunk by one belt. Day 3. Held ground. The mouth and the first compound belt. Not held ground. The ribbon above. On the third day, the Taliban began to change their tactics. Ambushes on the movement between compounds. Rocket-propelled grenades from further away, arcing in over walls. Fire from the high ground where Australian sniper teams had not yet reached. Someone on the enemy side was thinking about the shape of what was happening and adjusting to it. The Australians answered by pushing higher. Small teams broke off the compound clearing to move onto the ridge spurs above the ribbon. It was hard work. The spurs were dry, exposed, without cover. A man moving up a spur in July heat with a weapon and water and a radio is a man who is going to be tired inside 40 minutes and needing sleep inside 4 hours. The teams went up anyway. The spurs got taken. Once the spurs were taken, the shape of the valley began to look different. The Taliban fighters inside the ribbon could no longer look down onto the compound clearing from above. They were now being looked down on. Sniper teams read the rooftops. Joint offensive support cells brought in coalition, close air support against identified positions. Fixed-wing aircraft ran overhead in orbits. Attack helicopters worked the ridges. The men in the compounds fought on, but their overlook was gone, and the arithmetic of the fight in the ribbon began to shift. There was fighting throughout day 3 and into the night. Night in Chora was not dark for the Australians the way it was for the Taliban. Night vision worked. Thermal worked. The Chinooks moved men and stores and casualties in the dark into landing zones marked with infrared strobes that the human eye could not see. For a defender with none of those things, the night was where advantage was lost. The Australians pushed at night on purpose. It was harder on them. It was harder on the men opposing them by a much greater margin. Day 3 closed with the ribbon narrower and the ridges above it in Australian hands. Day 4 held ground. The mouth, the first belt, the low ridgeline. Not held ground. The upper compounds, the deeper orchards, the far end. The 4th day was the hardest fighting of the operation, not because of any single dramatic event, because of the accumulated weight of what the men were doing. Sleep debt from 3 nights of moving, heat exhaustion beginning to shape decisions, ammunition consumption running higher than a peacetime training establishment would ever project, water still the ration nobody could beat, boots beginning to come apart on the ridges, radios running on charge cycles that would have been rejected in barracks, small injuries accumulating on nearly every man, and a Taliban force inside the ribbon that had done its own calculation and decided that the fourth day was the day to stand. There is a particular quality to the fatigue of that kind of operation that people who have not done it do not easily picture. It is not the tiredness of a hard day's work. It is the tiredness of a hard day's work stacked on top of 3 previous hard days' work done in 40-degree heat, in body armor, on rations, on limited sleep, with the constant background pressure of the possibility of being shot at coming through a doorway at any moment. It compounds. By day 4, a man has lost weight. His mouth tastes of dust. His hands have small cuts he does not remember getting. His feet are blistering inside boots he has not taken off in more than a day. He is drinking as much water as he can carry, and it is not enough. He is aware, on some level below thought, that his margin for error has narrowed. He is aware that the man next to him is in the same state. He does his job anyway. That is what the training does. It gives you the equipment to keep working past the point where a normal person would stop. Inside a walled compound in the Middle Belt, on the 4th morning, a commando assault team took entry through a courtyard door and moved into a room they had thought was clear. It was not clear. A Taliban fighter had held position behind a rear wall, alone, and waited. He engaged at less than 5 meters. The team returned fire and killed him. 2 of the team were wounded. Australian medics on the entry stack moved in within seconds. The wounded were stabilized inside the compound and taken out by ground move to a casualty collection point, and from there by air. The team continued clearing the compound. The compound was taken. That was one compound of many, on one morning of many. Multiply it out across a synchronized clearing. Every hour of the 4th day contained events like that. Not all of them ended with only wounded. The Australian killed in Operation Perth fell inside the ribbon during this stretch of the operation, in circumstances that were reported at the time and afterward, with the care and respect they were due. The task group observed a minute of silence. The clearing continued. That is what a synchronized clearing means. There is not a moment when the operation stops for the men who are inside it. The dead go back through the chain. The living stay on the line. The ground still has to be taken. Day 4 closed with 2 more compound belts in Australian hands and casualties running through the medical chain. Day 5 held ground. 3 compound belts, not held ground, the upper orchards. By the 5th day, the Taliban still fighting inside the ribbon knew what was happening. What was happening was that the valley they had used freely for a very long time was being systematically reduced. Some fighters withdrew into deeper cover in the upper orchards and grape huts. Others tried to slip out of the valley altogether through the high ground and were engaged by sniper teams and coalition air on the ridgelines. Others stayed and fought where they were, in the belief that fighting from prepared positions was still the best play. The Australians did not care which was which. Each option ended the same way. The men who withdrew were engaged from above. The men who tried to leave were engaged on the ridges. The men who stayed were cleared out of the compounds. There was no 4th option that the ground allowed. On the 5th day, the Chinooks became decisive. To understand what those aircraft did in the Chora Valley, you have to understand what they replaced. Ground movement in the valley was slow, exposed, and hard. Every meter of it cost water and cost time. Every casualty evacuation by ground took men off the fight to run the stretcher party. Every resupply by ground was another vulnerable convoy inside a valley that had been sown, in places, with improvised explosive devices before the Australians ever entered it. The Chinooks, flown by the 5th Aviation Regiment out of Kandahar and out of forward locations, took all of that off the ground. Casualty evacuation went by air. Resupply went by air. Blocking teams could be lifted onto ridgelines above the ribbon and put in position before dawn. Reconnaissance patrols could be extracted from ground they no longer needed to hold and reinserted somewhere they did. The pace of the operation was set by the aircraft as much as by the men on the ground. Chinook flying in that geography was not routine. High altitude in July heat robs performance. Landing zones inside a valley with active fighting are exposed to small arms and shoulder-fired weapons. The crews flew with door gunners, with escorts where they could be arranged, and with the calculation always running, that a helicopter loss inside the valley would be catastrophic, not just for the crew and the men aboard, but for the shape of the whole operation. There was no helicopter loss inside the valley. The crews took the calculations and flew anyway. Australian aviators later described those weeks as the hardest flying they had done in their careers. It looked from the ground like the aircraft belonged there. It felt in the cockpit like something that was being done at the edge of what could be done. A casualty evacuation in that valley worked like this. A wounded man was stabilized by his patrol medic where he fell or moved a short distance to cover if the position he had fallen in was not defendable. A message went up the radio net to the task group headquarters with grid, priority and casualty description. Headquarters passed the tasking to the aviation cell. A Chinook lifted from a forward base with a medical team aboard and an escort where one was available. The ground team on the receiving end moved the wounded to a landing zone that had been identified in advance, or more often, to a piece of open ground that would do. Smoke went off to mark the zone. The aircraft came in low and hard, load, lift, away. Total ground time under a minute in most cases. From wound to hospital, if everything worked, was measured in tens of minutes rather than hours. That capability, coming out of a small air element, working in high heat and inside contested airspace, was the reason that 13 wounded men were 13 recovered men. In a different war, in a different geography, with different aviation support, some of them would not have been. Day 5 closed with the upper orchards under pressure, but not yet held. Day 6 held ground, 3 belts and the low ridges. Not held ground, the upper orchards and the far end. The 6th day was consolidation and push. Consolidation on ground already held, because the Taliban had begun to work back into cleared compounds in small numbers, probing to see whether the Australians were staying. They were staying. Overwatch positions were set. Sniper teams were rotated. The compound belts already taken were held with a small number of men each, enough to hold, not so many that the forward clearing lost weight. Every man not on the forward line was a man not moving the shape. The push on day 6 was upward, into the orchards. Orchards in Chora were not open ground with rows of trees. They were walled orchards, thick with growth, connected to compounds by narrow tracks and irrigation ditches. Movement inside an orchard was single file. Visibility was 30 meters in some directions and 3 meters in others. Fighting inside an orchard was extremely close and extremely hard to control. A man could hear another man breathing before he could see him. Grenades could not be used the way they had been used in compound rooms because the risk of tree burst was too high. Small arms discipline had to be absolute. The Australians took the orchards the way they had taken the compounds. Small teams, deliberate movement. Air overhead. The Dutch commandos of the KCT worked alongside them in coordinated task organization, taking sectors and reporting them held. When it was possible to bring fire from outside the orchard onto identified positions rather than clearing them by hand, that fire was brought. When it was not possible, the orchards were cleared by hand. Combat engineers moved with the assault teams to deal with wires, improvised charges, and the odd doorway rigged to catch the entry. Day 6 closed with the orchards partly held, and the far end of the valley in sight. Day 7 held ground, 3 compound belts, the low ridges, the orchards below the upper compounds. Not held ground, the upper compounds and the far end. On the 7th day, the shape of the valley had almost closed. What was left was the upper end of the ribbon, where the last compound clusters sat against the base of the mountains, and where the remaining Taliban fighters had fallen back to make what stand they were going to make. Reconnaissance from the ridges reported the disposition.
In 2006, 300 Australian commandos walked into a valley in southern Afghanistan that barely existed on coalition maps. They expected to stay for 9 days. What they found was an enemy willing to fight from behind thick mud walls, hidden rooftops, narrow courtyards, and mountain ridges overlooking every move they made. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Ammunition and water ran low. Sleep disappeared. And every doorway could be hiding a fighter waiting to kill them at point-blank range. But the Australians kept moving forward, compound by compound, wall by wall, metre by metre. This wasn't a conventional battle. It was a 9-day fight where the enemy was almost impossible to see, until he was only a few feet away. Stay with us, because what happened inside the Chora Valley would become one of the fiercest battles Australian forces had fought since Vietnam.
Assault teams were rotated onto the line and given rest before the move. Air was allocated. Blocking positions were confirmed. Radio traffic went quiet. Then the 7th day's clearing began. It was, in the accounts that came out later, the day that felt most like the way people imagine a battle. Prepared enemy positions inside a small area. Australian assault teams closing on them from several directions. Air overhead. Sniper teams on the high ground providing overwatch. Rocket-propelled grenades outbound and inbound. Machine guns cyclic. The fight was measured in single compounds and in the numbers of Taliban dead inside them. There were minutes on the 7th day when the volume of fire coming out of the ribbon was the highest of the operation, and there were minutes when it went dead silent because the men on the other side were repositioning or because they were finished. The Australians did not lose anyone on the 7th day. Wounded went back through the chain and were replaced on the line by rotated men. Day 7 closed with the upper compounds cleared and the far end of the valley open to the next move. Day 8. Held ground, nearly all of the ribbon. Not held ground, the far end and the ground beyond it. The 8th day was the day of thoroughness. It is one thing to clear ground. It is another thing to know it is clear. Weapons caches were located and destroyed. Papers were bagged and moved back for exploitation. Compounds that had shown signs of long Taliban use were photographed. The Dutch and the Australians walked the ribbon together, section by section, verifying. The reconnaissance patrols pushed further out, beyond the far end of the valley, to check that no significant force was massing beyond it, and to give the operation a picture of the ground going out. The blocking positions on the flanks held their line and reported no significant movement across them for the whole day. What the men who did that walking found, in the compounds and the grape huts and the underground rooms, was the material evidence of what the valley had been used for. Rifles and ammunition in quantities that had been stored for a longer campaign. Rocket-propelled grenades and their launchers. Mortars. Anti-personnel mines. Component parts of improvised explosive devices. Some of them ready to be assembled. Some of them mid-manufacture. Radios. Papers with lists of names and phone numbers. Cash. Medical stores. Food for 100 men for a month. The Chora Valley in July of 2006 had been a warehouse for the Taliban campaign against the coalition in Uruzgan. The task group emptied the warehouse. By the end of the 8th day, the men doing the clearing had been on the ground almost continuously for a week. Their kit was salt-stained. Their boots were coming apart. Their radios had been running on charge cycles that would have failed peacetime standards. Injuries that were not going to take a man out of the fight had accumulated in small numbers on nearly every one of them. The medical chain had processed the wounded and cleared them where clearing was possible. The task group headquarters had run for a week on rotations of sleep measured in hours rather than nights, and the shape on the map board at task group headquarters was almost closed. Day 8 closed with the far end of the valley in Australian hands. Day 9 held ground, the valley. Not held ground, none. On the 9th day, the operation was extraction. Consolidation of gains, handover to follow-on forces where handover was possible, deliberate withdrawal where it was not. The valley was not going to remain full of 300 Australian Special Forces indefinitely. It could not. What Chora Valley had been used for was going to have to be denied by other means. Over the following weeks and months, through partnered patrols and Dutch presence, and follow-on Australian operations and Afghan National Army lift, where lift could be found. The 300 had done what a small force could do. They had shown that the valley could be entered and taken and held for 9 days by men who came prepared for what was inside it. That, more than any single tactical outcome, was what Perth was about. It was a demonstration in the specific sense that generals mean when they use the word, it said. To the Taliban and to the coalition and to the Afghan population in the ribbon, that the valley was reachable. It said that the shape could be closed. The men came out, the cost both sides plainly, and with the sourcing set out. The Australians reported 1 killed and 13 wounded from Operation Perth itself. Those figures are the official Australian ones from the operation, and they are the ones that stand. Every wounded man was recovered. Every man was accounted for. The Australian killed was mourned by his unit and by his family and by his country, in the way those things are done in the Australian Defence Force, without noise, with respect, and with the understanding that the men he had been with were going to be back on operations very quickly and would carry him with them when they went. On the other side, the Australians and the coalition reported approximately 150 Taliban killed during Operation Perth. That figure is a reported estimate. It was reached by the way estimates of that kind are always reached in that kind of fighting. Bodies counted, where they were found, positions assessed after they were cleared, airstrike effects observed and reported by air controllers and by ground teams. No one at the task group ever presented it as an exact number, and it should not be treated as one. It is the best estimate the men who did the fighting could make of what they had done. It stands as an estimate. Some Taliban dead will have been carried away. Some will have been counted twice. Some will not have been counted at all. That is the shape of that kind of arithmetic. It is honest to say so. In September of that year, 3 months after Operation Perth ended, the Herald Sun in Melbourne ran a story on the operation and described it as the bloodiest battle Australians had fought since Vietnam. That phrase carried. It travelled through other Australian newspapers and appeared in defence reporting for years after. It meant, and it should be read as meaning, the highest intensity of Australian close combat since that war. It did not mean, and it should not be read as meaning, higher casualties than that war. Vietnam cost Australia 521 lives across a decade of fighting. Chora cost 1 Australian life across 9 days. The comparison the newspaper was reaching for was about the character of the fighting, not the arithmetic of it. Close, dense, compound range, prolonged, fought inside walls, not across open ground, fought by small teams inside small spaces against an enemy that had prepared the terrain in its own time. The word bloodiest in that headline was doing work as an adjective about how, not how many. That is worth saying twice, because the headline outlived the article, and the two things are not the same. What the valley looked like on day 9 is a picture worth holding. The compounds were still there. Mud walls do not go away. The families who lived in them had, in most cases, left before the operation began and would come back after it. The Australians had done what they could to preserve the fabric of the valley for the people it belonged to. Not everything can be preserved when compound clearing happens. Doors get broken. Walls take small arms hits. Roofs take grenades. But the compounds stood, and the fields were still there, and the irrigation channels were still there, and the grape huts, minus the caches under them, were still there. A local family walking back into a compound in September would see damage. They would also see a compound that could be lived in again. That distinction mattered to the men who had done the clearing. It was something they thought about. The weapons hides under grape hut floors had been emptied, and the caches destroyed, and the papers taken. The fighting positions that had been prepared in courtyards had been cleared and photographed. The strong points on the high ground that had let Taliban fighters overlook the ribbon had been sat on by Australian teams for 9 days. The lines of communication that had run down the valley from the mountains to the low country had been broken. Uruzgan province, in that direction, had 1 fewer store cupboard. That was what 300 Australians had gone in to do. They did it in 9 days. Operation Perth was one operation inside a much longer Australian deployment in Uruzgan. Across the deployment period from which Perth is drawn, the Special Operations Task Group was on patrol for 306 days. It was involved in 139 contacts. That ledger is worth reading slowly. 306 days on patrol. 139 contacts. Numbers of that scale, coming out of a force that never numbered more than a few hundred men in country at a time, describe an operational tempo that few Australian formations have ever sustained. There is not much precedent for it in Australian military history, and the precedent that exists is not recent. The men who did it did not describe it in those terms. They described it in terms of ground taken, ground held, ground handed over, ground lost when handover did not go the way it was supposed to. Ground walked over again a year later, a rotation later, by different men wearing the same patch, doing the same work. That is what the whole Australian Special Operations effort in Afghanistan looked like from the inside, a running argument with terrain. The Chora Valley in July of 2006 was one paragraph of that argument. 300 men, 9 days, 1 killed, 13 wounded, an estimated 150 on the other side. A valley that had been closed to the coalition for a very long time, walked into, taken and held for the time that it took to do the work. A Dutch partnership that ran cleanly at the sharp end and gave the KCT and the Australian Special Operations community a shared reference point that they would draw on for years. A demonstration to the enemy and to everyone else watching that the ground inside the ribbon was not off the map after all. The wider war in Uruzgan did not end in July of 2006. It did not end for a long time after. The Taliban came back into parts of the valley. Coalition forces went back in to push them out. The Dutch stayed in the province for years. The Australians rotated task groups through Tarin Kout for years. Villages that were quiet in one rotation were contested in the next. The mat board never quite settled. That is the honest end of the story, and the men who fought Perth would be the first to say so. They did not believe, when they walked out on the 9th day, that they had solved Uruzgan. They believed they had done a piece of work. The work was that valley, for those 9 days. It was work of a kind that had not been done in Uruzgan before Perth. The men who came after would build on it. The immediate aftermath at Tarin Kout was mundane in the way that the immediate aftermath of that kind of operation almost always is. The task group came back into base by air and by ground, move over the course of the 9th day and into the 10th. Kit was cleaned, weapons were cleaned, ammunition was counted back in, and the difference was noted. Medical assessments were run on every man returning. The wounded who had been evacuated forward were tracked. The one man who had not come back was written up, and his family was contacted through the proper channels, and his mates began to work through the private business of loss in the private way that men in those units do. Debriefs happened. What had worked was captured. What had not worked was captured with the same honesty, because that is the only way a small force gets better. Then, within days, the reconnaissance patrols went out again, because Uruzgan did not stop for Perth, and the next operation was already being planned. The men who wear the patches remember Chora by the ground. Ground is what you fight for. Ground is what you take. Ground is what the maps redraw when you have taken it. Ground is what other men have to hold behind you, if they can, so that the taking of it means anything at all. Ground is what you leave in the end, whether or not it has been kept. Ground is what your dead are counted against, and your wounded, and the fatigue in the shoulders of the men who came out with you, and the ones who did not. Ground is the currency of the kind of soldiering the 300 were doing in July of 2006. And ground, in the Chora Valley in July of 2006, cost the Australian Special Operations Task Group 9 days and 1 man and 13 wounded, and everything the 300 of them had inside their kit and their skin. That is what the newspapers, 3 months later, would find no better word for than bloodiest. That is what the men who were there, and the men who came after, would call by its right name, which was work.